Today's subject is a man whose voice helped launch rock and roll into living rooms across America, whose charm turned him into television's golden boy, and whose fall from stardom was as dramatic as his rise, Ricky Nelson. He was the golden boy of American rock and roll, a teen idol whose voice echoed through jukeboxes, living rooms, and concert halls across the country. With chart-topping hits like Poor Little Fool and Travelin' Man, Ricky Nelson didn't just perform music. He defined an era. But behind the fame, the screaming fans, and more than 50 Billboard hits, Ricky's most enduring legacy didn't come from the spotlight. It came from the 4 children he raised with actress Kristin Harmon, and one son he never fully embraced. While the world watched him grow up on the adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, Ricky was quietly trying to navigate adulthood on camera, fatherhood off camera, and the crushing pressure to live up to a family dynasty. He became a father at just 23, balancing concert tours and television scripts with diapers, late-night feedings, and a marriage that would soon spiral into turmoil. His children were born into a world of privilege, but not peace, shaped by a father who was both adored and conflicted, present and distant. And yet, through all the headlines and heartbreaks, those kids carried his name, his rhythm, and fragments of the man behind the legend. Today we uncover the story not of Ricky Nelson the star, but of Ricky Nelson the father, the man whose children grew up in the shadow of pop culture fame, but who ultimately found their own voices, sometimes in harmony with his, and sometimes in spite of it. This is the story of Ricky Nelson, and what happened to the 5 children of a man America never really stopped watching, even after he was gone. The first, she was born into fame before she could speak, and long before she could understand that her father, America's sweetheart in a cardigan, was slowly becoming a ghost in his own home. Tracy Kristin Nelson came into the world in October 1963, 6 months after Ricky Nelson and Kristin Harmon's hasty marriage, already a cover story. Behind closed doors, it was something else. Her father was touring nonstop, surrounded by hangers-on and groupies, while her mother, barely 18 when she gave birth, quietly slipped into addiction. By the time Tracy was 6, her parents' marriage had become a cold war. Kristin accused Ricky of drug use. Ricky retaliated with claims of her mental instability. The tabloids had a field day, but the real victim was the little girl caught between 2 collapsing worlds. When the marriage finally broke in the late 70s, the children watched as both parents tried to prove the other unfit. Ricky used lawyers. Kristin used painkillers. Tracy turned to acting, not just for career, but survival. Landing roles in Square Pegs and Father Dowling Mysteries, she created a stable public image, even as her private life was unraveling. At age 23, while filming, she was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. Days later, her father died in a plane crash. The twist? He left her nothing. Not a letter, not a dollar, not even acknowledgement in his will. But he left something deeper, unresolved trauma. Ricky had spent years denying the existence of a 5th child, Eric Crew, while emotionally detaching from the 4 he had in plain sight. That wound ran through Tracy, who had always hoped there'd be a final moment of connection. Instead, there was only silence. In the wake of his death, she stood beside her siblings, reading press statements as fans mourned the man they remembered, while she mourned the father she barely knew. Years later, she confessed, "I envied the fans. They got the best version of him." Tracy survived 3 battles with cancer, a rocky marriage, and raising children of her own. And while she never tried to erase the Nelson name, she rewrote what it meant. Her real triumph was breaking the cycle. She became the kind of parent her father couldn't be, present, transparent, and real. The legacy she inherited was fractured. The legacy she passed on was whole. The second, he was born with his father's jawline and his mother's instincts for survival. But Gunnar Nelson didn't inherit the spotlight. He inherited a burden. Born just minutes before his twin brother Matthew in 1967, Gunnar entered a world still clinging to Ricky Nelson's teen idol mythology. At first glance, the family looked like a California dream. A rock star dad, an actress mother, twin baby boys in matching jumpers. But by the time Gunnar could walk, the dream was already cracking. Ricky was touring constantly, and when he was home, he was distant, lost in rehearsals, resentment, and the slow death of his career. Kristin, meanwhile, was spiraling into addiction, often sleeping through the day or flying into rages that no child could understand. Gunnar didn't just grow up in a broken household. He grew up in a house where no one admitted it was broken. As a child, Gunnar watched his father go from sold-out stadiums to half-empty state fairs. He learned early that applause is temporary and fame is cruel when it forgets you. Ricky was changing, not just musically, but personally. In private, he struggled with money, addiction rumors, and shame. The twins were shielded from the worst of it, but not all of it. One night in 1980, after a screaming match between Ricky and Kristin turned violent, Gunnar and Matthew locked themselves in a bedroom and promised never to end up like their parents. The divorce came soon after, but the real rupture came later, in court, when their mother fought to keep custody by accusing Ricky of exposing the kids to drugs and chaos on tour. When Ricky died in a plane crash in 1985, Gunnar was only 18. He didn't just lose a father. He lost the one person who knew what it felt like to be born into an image. That same year, Gunnar and Matthew launched their band Nelson. Critics sneered. Labels hesitated. Pretty boys playing daddy's songs, they said. But in 1990, with the release of After the Rain, Gunnar got the last word. The album went platinum. Their song, Can't Live Without Your Love and Affection, hit #1. For a moment, it felt like redemption, but the twist came after the fame. Today, he still performs, mostly with his brother, in tribute tours called Ricky Nelson Remembered. But the legacy weighs heavier now. Gunnar once said in an interview, "We didn't just lose our dad, we inherited the mess he left behind." That mess included lawsuits, debts, and an estranged half-brother no one spoke about. But unlike Ricky, Gunnar stayed, with his own children, with his music, with the memories. He knows fame is fleeting, fatherhood isn't, and in that quiet choice, he rewrote the ending his father never got. The third, he shared a face, a voice, and a childhood with Gunnar. But Matthew Nelson's story runs quieter, darker, and more internal. Born minutes after his twin brother in September 1967, Matthew grew up under the same collapsing roof, but he processed everything differently. Where Gunnar lashed out, Matthew shut down. Where Gunnar sought the crowd, Matthew sought escape. From an early age, he gravitated toward melody, not just as a career, but as a form of control. Music gave structure to a home that had none. When Ricky and Kristin fought, which was often, Matthew would disappear into his guitar. He learned to harmonize with his brother in the same way he learned to survive the chaos, by keeping time, keeping quiet, and keeping moving. As their parents' marriage fell apart, Matthew was the one who mediated, who comforted Tracy when Kristin overdosed, who cleaned up the kitchen after one of Ricky's rage-filled silences. But even his loyalty had limits. When their parents finally divorced, Matthew didn't cry. He shut the door and started writing songs. And when their father, in an effort to regain control, took them on tour as teenagers and used backstage rooms as crash pads, Matthew began to question whether Ricky was a mentor or just a man clinging to relevance. The trauma hardened into ambition. In 1985, the plane crash that killed their father ripped through Matthew like a second divorce. He was 18, grieving a man he never really got to confront. And once again, Matthew turned to music. Together with Gunnar, he poured years of pressure into After the Rain. But behind the platinum success was a twin who felt invisible. The real twist came not in their rise, but in what followed. As their fame faded, Matthew turned inward. He battled depression, wrestled with the shadow of a father who died young, and tried to come to terms with the parts of himself that mirrored Ricky's worst impulses. Perfectionism, distance, silence. In interviews, Matthew rarely talks about Ricky directly, but when he does, it's with a kind of reluctant clarity. "He taught us what not to do," he once said, but we had to learn what to do on our own. Today, Matthew still performs, still writes, still stands beside his brother. Not as a replica of Ricky Nelson, but as someone who endured him. He never chased his father's approval. He buried it, and in doing so found his own rhythm, his own voice, and a legacy built not on fame, but on survival. The fourth, he was the youngest, the quietest, and the most protected. Or so they thought. Born in August 1974, Sam Nelson arrived after the storm, when Ricky and Kristin's marriage was already in ruins, but still pretending to function. By then, the twins were 7, Tracy was navigating adolescence, and Ricky was barely around. Sam didn't grow up in the golden glow of the adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. He grew up in the echo, in a house filled with legacy, addiction, and lawsuits. From his earliest memories, something always felt fractured. His father, though physically present in bursts, was emotionally absent. His mother, drowning in her own battles with pills and paranoia, often left Sam to be raised by nannies, siblings, or simply by silence. As a child, Sam witnessed things no child should see: late-night fights, slurred arguments, and the slow disintegration of trust between everyone around him. By age 10, he was no longer a child living in a dysfunctional home. He was the evidence in a legal war. In 1987, 2 years after Ricky's death, his uncle, actor Mark Harmon, filed for custody of Sam, accusing Kristin of being an unfit mother. The drama exploded in the tabloids. Sam, just 13, became a legal pawn in a family torn between love and reputation. His mother said it was a betrayal. His uncle said it was rescue. Sam never spoke publicly about how it felt, but the emotional shrapnel followed him into adulthood. After escaping that legal battle, Sam tried to disappear. He studied psychology and film, searching for answers, maybe even therapy by way of storytelling. But the pull of music, that inevitable Nelson gravity, dragged him back. As an adult, he stepped into the role of producer and creative director, eventually reviving the Stone Canyon band brand that his father had once led. Unlike his siblings, Sam never chased stardom. He stayed behind the curtain, crafting legacy instead of inheriting it. In private, he worked to understand the man behind the myth, the father who left behind no instructions, no inheritance, just a void and a name. The twist? Sam was the one who ultimately brought the family full circle. While his older siblings battled cancer, divorce, depression, and the long tail of fame, Sam chose healing. He became the quiet steward of the Nelson story, not by rewriting it, but by confronting it, curating archives, reviving music, and telling the truth without anger. He didn't perform his father's songs to feel close to him. He preserved them so the next generation could decide who Ricky Nelson really was. For Sam, the legacy wasn't the chart positions or the scandals. It was the hard-earned peace that comes from looking at a broken man and deciding you don't have to break with him. The final Eric Jude crew was the secret Ricky never wanted to face. Born in 1981 to George and Crew after a brief encounter, Eric was denied publicly and privately, until a 1985 paternity test confirmed Ricky was his father. By then, Ricky offered court-ordered support, but no relationship. Eric was never mentioned in interviews, never included in the will, and never embraced by the family. While his half-siblings grew up under the weight of fame, Eric grew up with the sting of absence. He lives a private life, far from the spotlight. The quiet reminder that Ricky Nelson's legacy was as complicated as it was celebrated. 5 children. They didn't ride their father's fame. They survived it. Tracy stood tall through cancer, grief, and silence. Gunnar and Matthew turned trauma into harmony, fighting to be heard in an industry that only saw their last name. Sam grew up in the aftermath, caught between courtrooms and confusion, yet became the quiet keeper of legacy. And Eric, the son left out of the story, lived with the truth no spotlight ever touched. They each carried a different piece of Ricky Nelson, his rhythm, his wreckage, and the long echo of a father who loved in fragments. If you found this breakdown powerful and want more deep dives into the hidden lives of Hollywood's forgotten children? Subscribe to Legacy Uncovered. Your support brings these invisible stories to light. Thanks for listening.